Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and caffeine addict. Today we are taking a look at Luton's Tyranids First Contact and the Battle of Macragge. This is one of his most popular videos with like 1.6 million views, and so I'm fascinated to break this down. And of course, anytime there's a battle, you know I'm going to be into it. Before we get started, of course, take a look down below. We've got the merch store. I have lots of new merch out, new stuff, new designs, new items, so be sure to check it out. Also, check out the second channel. It's more my generic gaming channel, but definitely also a fun time. Okay, having done that, let's look at some Tyranids. Luton. Yep, always only war. Also, shout out to Cripman, the boss, the Tyranid killer. Wow, wow. Guys, this is the most dramatic Luton video I've ever seen. By far. Oh man, he spent some coin editing this. This is compelling.
The Imperium of Man first made contact with a new Xenos species at the planet of Tyran. Imperial explorators, who are Mechanicus tech priests committed to exploration and exploitation of new planets and regions in the galaxy in the name of the Imperium, discovered a strange phenomena where planets previously recorded as lush and verdant were now barren husks. Not even a single cell of life remained. While this disturbing fact was immediately reported, the slow-turning cogs of the Imperium's bureaucracy was, as with most things, likely to raise not much more of an interest than the lift of an eyebrow. Stranger and more deadly things are likely occurring at almost any time than a planet simply just becoming a dead rock. Still, as the explorers...
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's lots of actually completely natural explanations for why that sort of thing would happen. An asteroid strike would be a simple reason. Something that changes the composition or obviously the heat profile of a planet. You could also have something like a large solar flare, like a gigantic burst of very powerful radiation that would just fry all life. You could even have something like an environmental collapse where a certain life source, or let's say even the heat of their sun, or like an energy source, is suddenly cut off, and all the subsequent species depend on it. That could happen on planet Earth. Let's say if the sun were to, have 95% of its illumination go away, say something passed in front between the Earth and the sun, that would probably be enough to exterminate all life within, a couple thousand years. What else would probably cause it? I think, too, you may have situations. I think the most likely that the Imperial bureaucracy probably said was clerical error, right? When you have a million planets, I can tell you I have seen spreadsheets with not even millions, not even hundreds of thousands, but just tens of thousands of entries. And the rate of error is like unreal. And that's, of course, with standardized spreadsheets, email, instant communication, and databases. So when you're talking about communicating over astropaths, the odds of just a routine clerical error are like phenomenal. And even if you saw them in the same geographic like path, like as the Tyranids would have carved through the galaxy, you would probably just assume that some tech priest explorer 1,000 years ago was just lazy. Was just lazy and stupid and misclassified a whole swath of planets. And they're long dead, and There's no reason to go after them. You just realize they made a mistake and you move on.
Operators would continue to report these strange dead worlds. A fleet of Xenos previously unrecorded would be drawing ever closer. A survey craft returning from studying these destroyed worlds encountered a strange cloud of unidentified objects entering the edge of the system. After taking some damage from strange organic mines in the edge of this cloud, the Imperial ship would manage to survive back to an Imperial base orbiting Tyran Primus with the disturbing reports. Days later, the Xenos fleet would now descend from the skies down to the surface of Tyran Primus. The main base on Tyran was a heavily fortified bunker system designed to withstand the ferocious storms of the ocean world. Coupled with the fact that its location on the edge of Imperial territory made it a likely target for Xenos attacks, so 4 immense planetary defense lasers were situated on the outpost, along with void shield generators, which are a form of gravitic energy field. It is typically utilized to defend super heavy vehicles and infrastructure. Often you see these used by starships and titans in the Imperium. Void shields displace ranged attacks by distorting space-time around the point of impact. The outpost was then further supported by an array of other weapon systems, including autocannon and las cannon, as well as various heavy bastions and bunkers. The defense complement itself was also formidable, with 3 full navy wings and a force of Skitarii, as well as finally an entire infantry regiment of Imperial Guard.
I mean, I gotta wonder, right, mathematically, what ratio of Imperial Guard have to fight in these like vicious campaigns versus get assigned to garrison some random world somewhere, right? And if so, like, has this Imperial Guard regiment seen action and then was rotated to Tyran Prime for a generation or two? Or is it just simply easier to just assign these Guard regiments permanently to a world? I mean, what you couldn't do is rotate individual guardsmen. That would be a complete waste of time. Again, it just raises a lot of questions about the Imperial Guard's policy of, again, guardsmen are better than a PDF. So logically, you'd want to use them in high-risk areas where combat is more likely. But again, on a frontier world, is it like you stick a guard regiment there? I mean, I guess you wouldn't put all this material there if there wasn't a pretty good chance that they would run into something. But maybe they're just a delaying force. They're meant to find that just delay that next orc invasion, fight a Eldar scout fleet, or just to deter, right? To let potentially extragalactic enemies know that this is not the best path into Imperial space because it's so heavily defended. That's also a really common tactic, to just use what's called a deterrent, which is where you, instead of concealing how much force you have in an area, you broadcast it. You let everyone know that bothers to ask or look that you have X amount of troops, X amount of hardware, X amount of aircraft in an area or with a certain mission, and that it's supposed to basically scare off challengers. Sort of like an animal, sort of like a lion, like preening and roaring in order to scare off any male challengers. The appearance of strength is a strength in and of itself. So that could definitely be a reason why so much would be assigned to this world of Tyran.
A standard deployment for any frontier planet that had been deemed the standardized force strong enough to repel most enemy assaults.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay, that answers that. It's a standard package for a frontier world. Again, the ratio of guardsmen that are in like vicious pitched battles against horrible enemies to guardsmen whose job is to mostly train, patrol, and occupy a peaceful garrison world. I'd love to know what that ratio is.
The alien horrors began to fall from the skies in an array of colours and strange storm-racked skies. The Imperial ground gunners attempted to engage and prevent any of the invaders from making planetfall. But just as suddenly as they'd begun, this attack from the strange unseen species would withdraw. Is this all they have? What an easy victory, mused the Imperial defenders. This ignorant overconfidence would soon be tragically misplaced. Major Varnak ordered a fleet of Imperial Navy cruisers to continue to harass the withdrawing Xenos as to make sure of their retreat and assumed broken morale. But upon following this command, the Imperial ships would quickly discover, as they pushed through the spore mine clouds that masked the Xenos fleet, they would see not a few, not even 100 of the strange bioships, but in fact, thousands. Having suffered minimal, if any, losses from the initial planetary engagement, swarms of Xenos ships would seize upon these easily stunned prey as they rounded on the Imperial ships. The first to be physically shredded was the Emperor's Fist, ripped apart by small invasive organisms spewed forth from a larger alien vessel. As the others were similarly cut to pieces or ripped apart by tendrils, the now absolutely panic-wrought crew in the last surviving ship were able to dispatch a warning to Tyran. While in the process of doing so, Genestealers had been unleashed into the ship's interior, efficiently and brutally slaughtering the entire crew complement in minutes.
So here is what is interesting. That strategy is a tried and true naval strategy, actually going back quite a long time. And that is the use of very small craft that have a very limited function to damage larger craft as a sort of vanguard, as a mix between a like satellite ship and a torpedo. And this is famously used by a number. I think there was an ancient battle in which ships were lit on fire and then pushed out into the sea in order to catch enemy ships aflame, right? Obviously, when you have a ship made of, in the age of sail, you had ships made of basically pine and pine pitch. So basically a candle and a wick that floats on the water. As you can imagine, didn't take much from these smoldering, flaming mini ships to light a good number aflame, and even more had to break formation to avoid these flaming ships. So it's, again, even in the modern era, we see it with very small coastal attack craft. That's one of these strategies that a lot of navies will employ if they think that there's a chance that a larger, more powerful naval force, like say the United States, will set up off of their coast. In order to disrupt operations, they will have small patrol craft operating in the dozens, and will try to swarm them in order to hit the ships with a torpedo or even potentially engage in a self-destructive charge. So it's a viable strategy for sure. And I'm sort of fascinated, again, that the Tyranids, who, as far as we can tell, hadn't really had contact with the Imperium, were able to effectively counter it so well, given that the Imperium fights very differently than many other factions. Again, the Tyranids would have a way different evolutionary strategy to counter orcs, and it makes sense that actually the first several engagements with the Tyranids would actually probably go in the Imperium's favor. You know, only after time and evolution would the Tyranid forces really evolve to be specialized human killers.
While in the background, other ships were already being absorbed into the fleet's bioreserves. The Xenos would now return to the orbit of Tyran, and there would be no respite this time, no withdrawal. Many thousands of their mycetic spores rained down to the planet's surface, with the Imperial outpost defences having little success in preventing them from doing so. As the ocean around the outpost began to foam and boil, the Imperial defenders looked on baffled and more than a little concerned. What kind of horror was this attack? Soon enough their answer is returned, as aliens the likes of which had never been seen before sprang from the watery gestation.
This is one of his best videos by far. By far.
Imperial Guard would quickly turn to...
I get it, it's probably a ton of work, but man.
...their instinctive training, and even were successful in repelling the first waves of attack by these savage alien creatures. No doubt bolstered by the fact that among their number were Guard veterans from the Imperial death world of Katashan, a nightmarish jungle planet. The lower bioforms of the attacking Xenos were little match for most standard Imperial weaponry, and the Gaunts and Genestealers would be significantly decimated. Things, though, began to quickly unravel as one of their planetary defense lasers would fall silent. It was literally choked and clogged by a mass of Xenos gargoyles that had been instructed from the hive mind to force themselves down into its barrel and inner workings. Now the larger bioforms like Carnifexes would begin to appear, ripping through defenses and destroying further weapon installations.
These just sound like StarCraft sounds, honestly.
The Xenos were turning the tables, and it was now only a matter of time before the guardsmen would be horribly dismembered and then consumed. The outpost soon is overrun by the alien horrors, and its heavy bastions and bunkers smashed to pieces or enveloped by this highly aggressive Xenos. Only Tyran's command bunker remained, and it was already beginning to buckle and crack under the weight of unrelenting damage being wrought to its exterior by huge aliens smashing their way inside. Major Varnak saw there was no hope. This was the end. The few remaining Imperial Guard in Skitarii would fight down to their very flesh and bone before these savage invaders would seethe and flow through the command bunker's corridors. Major Varnak would pray to his Omnissiah before sending a data codex deep into the lowest levels, specially constructed as a kind of black box for the outpost. This data would be their legacy to the Imperium of Man, its records providing essential information for the Imperium and humanity.
Yeah, well, as we see with, of course, his analogies right there, the aircraft black box, the ability to recreate the outcomes in a disaster is so important because it's essential to understand both what happened and how to prevent it going forward. One of the things that's really hard is often when you have these disasters, they're almost always multi-cause. Right. Obviously, this is an exception. It's an invading force, but and the defenders were never going to be able to succeed just by sheer numbers. But in other types of disaster, I'm thinking things like Chernobyl or an aircraft crash or another military disaster. It's really important to be able to honestly and frankly reconstruct what happened and why. And to do that, you have to be able to kill some sacred cows. You've got to be able to speak truth to power. Again, imagine if, say, there was an Imperial commander, right, a sector-level commander in the Astra Militarum, who was fixated on this sort of defense posture with Skitarii and guard regiments and defense lasers, and the honest investigation found that those were liabilities, that they were designed to fight capital ships, let's say, and not these sort of swarmed Tyranid forces. Maybe even that las guns, as they were issued, were just not done right. Maybe there's even worse issues, like many of the guardsmen didn't have up-to-date las guns. They didn't have power packs that were properly stored and so ran out of ammo too quickly. Right? These are the sort of things that can make people in power look bad, even in a non-democracy. And so it's really hard to do these sort of reports, honestly, because the people in power often want to see their political enemies be blamed for these bad events. Look at the U.S. in Benghazi when, despite being an extremely fast-breaking situation that was almost impossible for even the people on the ground to understand what was happening, it became a political football where we tried to blame someone, the then Secretary of State, who was 15 levels up. And, sometimes there's definitely a discussion to be had about the aftermath and how to deal with some of these things and whether or not it was discussed honestly. But to assign proactive blame for these sort of situations is a political exercise. And what's hard is someone, somewhere, should do honest reporting about these sort of disasters. And it's made harder when that person doesn't have the independence or is just in an environment where there's certain people and things and ideas which can never be questioned. In fact, that's the whole second half of the miniseries Chernobyl, is exactly what it's like to do an honest inquiry in an environment where there are certain unquestionable truths.
As Cripman approached the now dead, sterile world, he discovered that it had been ravaged of all life, even its oceans and atmosphere. Searching for the standard Imperial data codex that is secured in such a catastrophic destruction of an Imperial outpost, what he found was more disturbing than he could have imagined. And seeing the videos and accumulated data of the Xenos assault, Cripman would immediately leave the planet to communicate and convey the severity and imminent danger posed by this new and horrific alien threat. A horror he would subsequently name Tyranids. The planet of Tyran would hold the morbid honour of now becoming their official designation. Inquisitor Cripman attempted to use his astropath on board to project a vision of his discovery to the Imperium's network, only to discover that this was not possible. Something was preventing the astropath from communicating. This, of course, was the psychic disturbance caused by the Hive Fleet. So he instead proceeded to the next nearest Imperial planet of Thandros in the hopes of establishing communication, only to discover this world had also been ravaged and was now a sterile, dead planet. As is often the case with planets in the Imperium, sometimes entire worlds are lost without anybody even realizing it until years later. Eventually, after successfully establishing communications, he was ordered to proceed to the planet of Macragge, the Space Marine chapter homeworld of the UltraMarines. The alien fleet would be designated Behemoth. Thanks largely to the information gathered from the Tyran data codex, the Astartes and Imperial forces on Macragge were now able to formulate a plan in its defence. The chapter master Marneus Calgar quickly ordered its already immense, powerful defences strengthened. In addition to the existing Imperial ships in orbit, more arrived daily, including massive strike cruisers and Ultramarines battle barges. One thing was for sure, the Tyranid threat would have a far more challenging battle to be fought here than at Tyran and Thandros. It would not be until a month later that the Tyranids would finally begin to assault Macragge. Over 1,000 of the Xenos ships had been present entering the system and had now already ravaged the garden world of Prandium, a former lush paradise, a garden world, a glory to behold, and now a broken wasteland of death.
I mean, here's the problem with the scale at which Tyranids operate, is that if you really could strip all life on Earth and convert it into weapons, you would not be able to raise almost any army or navy or warfighting force. Even if you would need probably a millionfold or more planets to equal that size of a single planet being stripped and converted to weapons. So the idea that there is even a conceivable number of human forces that could be rallied in time to fight off an entire Tyranid Hive Fleet is probably not realistic. Unless, of course, their conversion rate of mass was extremely, extremely poor. Where it was like, even if I guess it had 1% of the biological mass of some of these planets, it still wouldn't do well. Now, again, math is hard, and so it could be a case of, like, let's say it was an ice world where there was only really life on, like, the very, very thin film of the equator, or it was like a colony world where there was a handful of, like, agricultural colonies that could exist, and the rest of the world was already pretty, like, bare. But again, stripping a garden world, even if you had just a 1% conversion rate, would still make it would still just bolster your numbers just immensely.
Even with Cripman's warnings, the first-hand accounts of the previously lush planet being turned to dead rock, Calgar was taken aback by the devastation of the Jewel of Ultramar. In Calgar's preparations, he would form 3 massive armies on the surface of Macragge, and as the first spores would begin to fall, the powerful Astartes regiments would begin their stand against the alien horrors. Calgar himself had formed the largest of these 3 armies and would carry out repeated rearguard assaults to wither and crush the Tyranid swarms. But the unrelenting weight and force of the Tyranids could not be suppressed, even with the power of the Ultramarines on their home planet. On the planet's surface, Titans stalked the land, obliterating any alien swarms in their path. The ferocity of the Tyranid assault was something never seen before by the Astartes, and some even saw the colossal titans be dragged down to the ground before being brutally torn to pieces by the blurred forms of Claw and Chitin. First Company veteran Ultramarines would lay waste to these foul Xenos horrors, but deep inside their bunkers.
Yeah, listen, I'm going to be honest, 1,000 Ultramarines, the scale of Warhammer 40k always gets really bizarre. 1,000 Ultramarines is like a rounding error to again, a force large enough to, a force with the biomass of an entire garden world. 1,000 Ultramarines is like a rounding error, right? I mean, it's a rounding error in terms of modern militaries, right? 1,000 elite troops could do a lot more than 1,000 regular troops worth of damage, but in the scale of armies of tens of millions, they're virtually nothing.
Holding every piece of ground until it could no longer be held, but slowly retreating inside their fortress. The attacking Tyranids would be relentlessly slaughtered like an ocean of alien bodies, exploding, disintegrating and being vaporized by the unwavering but slowly withdrawing.
I really think this is StarCraft sound effects.
Us.
Which of course are perfect because StarCraft is as close as you can get to being a Games Workshop IP without having to pay them royalties.
Astartes. As the fighting became ever more brutal and desperate, with much of Calgar's defense forces now slaughtered, one of the final battles would be fought on a location known as Cold Steel Ridge. The previously masterful rearguard army of Calgar here would find their match, as the Hive Mind had learned and adapted to his battle tactics. To compound the situation, the Tyranids would deploy a bioform later classified by the Imperium as a Swarm Lord. This massive creature was one of the final forms to lead assaults on Tyran and Thandros. Using the power of the Hive Mind, the Tyranids' previously mindless, animalistic, furious assaults now became viciously focused, even tactical. Over the remaining hours, the Swarm Lord would launch attacks again and again, killing scores of auxiliary troops in the most savage and horrific ways imaginable, no doubt in an attempt to horrify and break the human enemy. Torn apart, flayed, penetrated, dissolved, eaten alive, inside or out, the carnage continued on and on until the powerful Astartes began to appear outmatched by this previously mindless horror. Sensing victory, the Swarm Lord along with Tyranid warriors thrust into the fight and engaged Calgar himself. As the Ultramarines circled to aid the Chapter Master, Tyranids lying dead sprung to life, evidently feigning death in a suppressed state by the Swarm Lord so as to launch unexpected attacks on the now compromised Ultramarine defenders. Calgar would be torn and savagely injured by this assault, and the remaining forces were forced into...
Sorry, when did Games Workshop introduce the Tyranids as a playable faction?
...retreating to the battle barge Octavius. One of, if not the strongest defences of Macragge was its polar fortresses and massive ground weapons that fired high into orbit, obliterating the Xenos raining down onto the planet. The Tyranids, now being highly aware of this concentration of firepower, proceeded to rain down thousands more spores in this polar area, and Tyranids would now begin to appear in even greater numbers, and the fortresses were soon seething with alien horrors. With few options available, Calgar had to trust his planet-side Astartes would handle the tidal wave of Xenos, now engulfing their bunkers. So Calgar would instead turn his attention to the Hive Fleet, determined that if Macragge must fall, no other planet would. Despite the Imperial fleet and the remaining planetary defences engaging the orbiting bioships and destroying hundreds of them en masse, many more remained, and wave after wave would assault the ships in space and the surface of the planet. By the time the Tyranids were deploying their 12th wave of attacks, the orbital defences of Macragge were now essentially annihilated, and so the Tyranids would even further intensify their attacks. Calgar would attempt to seize on this by assaulting their ships in orbit. The Tyranids were spread out in their attempts to envelop the planet, and then they would start to now withdraw their bioships, pull the engaging Imperial space vessels away from Macragge so as to be unable to assist the forces on the ground, especially around its polar bunkers and outposts. What the Tyranids could not have foreseen, though, was the arrival of the reinforcing battle fleet Tempestus, catching them now in between two Imperial fleets.
So I guess in this lore, an Imperial fleet is comparable to a Tyranid Hive swarm in terms of scale. Again, I really struggle to see the math there, but maybe it's possible that if you're a Tyranid, like 99% of your swarm is either inert biomass that's just like floating fuel, or is some sort of logistics, or is the Tyranid version of, just like a support craft, right? That seems really actually, that seems maybe the most plausible thing, where you just don't divert that much energy to warfighting and instead devote most of it to logistics. I mean, that's true of almost all armies in the world, even now, where despite all our technology, all our automation, all our efficiencies, if you totaled up all the contractors and uniformed soldiers, most militaries, for every one fighting vehicle or man, have probably between 10 and 12, I would say, logistics support personnel. Maybe even more if you include things like war manufacturing industries and things like the VA, right, a medical organization healing wounded soldiers. So if you're a Tyranid bioform, even if you're brutally efficient in how you do things, or a Tyranid Hive Fleet, you still probably would be in a situation where you would have to devote most of your resources to non-combat entities, or combat support entities, even if you were a dedicated warfighting Hive Fleet. But again, it's also possible that if you're a Tyranid fighting in a world like the Imperium, where the vast majority of worlds can be conquered undefended, maybe the Tyranid Hive Fleet would logically just say, hey, as soon as we encounter resistance, we're just going to dip, right? We'll fight them a little bit. We'll fight them with, a fraction of a percent of our warfighting capacity. But as soon as we realize it's going to become a big saga, we're just going to withdraw and find another planet that isn't defended, and we'll just suck that dry, right? That, to me, also makes a lot of sense.
But even so, the Tyranid Hive Fleet was far from outmatched, and likely both fleets could have been potentially destroyed were it not for the supreme sacrifice of the mammoth Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra. It would plough straight into the heart of the Hive Fleet and sacrifice itself by detonating its warp drives, subsequently creating a warp vortex and dragging itself and the entire Tyranid fleet into total oblivion. Calgar's remaining forces rounded to return to Macragge and save the few, if any, Astartes forces that had managed to hold out in overwhelmed polar fortresses. Contact with the First Company veterans had now long been lost as the Tyranids.
So that's interesting. That, again, this is the Imperium's most frustrating facet. Is you have the technology to build a Hive Fleet swallowing bomb, right? And yet you refuse probably to do so. You can only build the same stupid ships again and again and again, right? Why would you not just build a skeleton ship with a skeleton crew or a servitor crew or something where that goes in, right? I mean, it's also the Imperium, right? A dedicated suicide unit is not that unheard of, right? So you just staff them with a Kriegsman navy, and you go, your sacrifice will be remembered, and you tell them, hey, plunge into this Hive Fleet, detonate your warp drive, especially if you weaponize it, I bet you could make it even more effective, and you suck that whole fleet right on home. In fact, you could probably do it with a lot of fleets. You could probably do it to the Necrons. You could do it to anybody.
Overran the polar outpost, and Calgar, concerned by this, deployed the 3rd and 7th Companies by drop pod to the polar regions.
Yes. Dozens of Marines will surely stop this Tyranid invasion.
As the Marines burst from their pod deployments, the scenes that met them were beyond belief. Hundreds of thousands of shredded and compounded Tyranid bodies lay piled as far as could be seen, and huge craters existed where plasma weapons and Titan reactors had gone critical, pocketing the surface of the land. Linking up quickly with any surface survivors, they pushed down into the depths of the outposts, clearing any Xenos they encountered. The 3rd Company, though, on landing was far less successful and came under heavy attack as soon as they made planetfall. Many hundreds of Tyranids sprang from the dark outpost entrances to engage them, but heavy fire from the Marines and Thunderhawk gunships overhead crushed them and drove them back into the darkness of the reinforced outposts. On entering the darkened corridors of the outpost as the 7th Company had done, the 3rd began to notice how walls and structural elements were dripping with mucus, and it seemed that in many places solid material appeared to be breaking down. They would lay down heavy flame units through the corridors to clear their advances, slowly progressing deeper into the bunkers. As the 3rd Company continued to burn their way into the darkness, every step crushing alien chitin and acidic blood splashing
I don't even know what chitin is.
Everywhere, they slowly entered the deepest areas of the bunkered outposts in the polar region. And it was here that they would finally find the last remaining 1st Company veterans. A single circle of Space Marines in Terminator armour laying slumped back to back, having been savagely ended by the Xenos horrors. There were no 1st Company Ultramarines remaining. They had been killed to the last man.
Ooh, dark.
After the nightmare that was the battle for their chapter world, they faced the huge task of rebuilding their chapter, notably the veteran 1st Company, which had been so brutally obliterated. This task would be bequeathed to Chaplain Cassius, who would request to Calgar that the new 1st Company veterans be drawn from the ranks of those who had survived the tyrannic assault, as only they could understand this threat and the consequences of a tyrannic war. These elite veterans make up the now reformed 1st Company of the Ultramarines. The Battle for Macragge is a bittersweet victory for the Ultramarines, having been successful against such a horrific enemy, but also suffering such devastating losses. The names of their fallen brothers are commemorated each year, and their sacrifices remembered throughout the Ultramar system. And so the Tyranids would not be seen for over 200 years, until without warning in 993 of Millennium 41, a new invasion fleet would appear. Hive Fleet Kraken, which would now engage with simultaneous attacks on planets throughout the system. Eventually this assault would also be repelled, but the Tyranids would again be detected by Inquisitor Cripman in 997 of Millennium 41, only 4 years later. Cripman was able, by burning out Astra Pass, to discern this new fleet Leviathan's intended course of attack through its targeted system. But despite some initial defensive successes, Cripman would order the act of exterminatus on the world of Cordilis, the next planet in the Tyranids' path, so as to reduce their ability to increase their biomass. Despite Imperial Navy objections, Cripman would succeed in carrying out his exterminatus to the planet and its population.
I mean, you could make this work, but here's the thing, you also have to raise the costs. So the Tyranid Hive Fleet basically needs to have this phenomenal cost associated with a dud, right? So when it gets to an empty planet and it shows up thinking that it's going to be a tasty planet, and then instead of getting badly needed biomass, they have to meet really what they should meet. Again, the Imperium has no upgrades in technology, so it won't. But what it should meet is a fleet of automated ships ready to just turn that whole stupid planet into a warp storm. And in fact, I would argue that that's probably the way to do it. To just tear a huge warp hole, right? Or detonate your warp drive and create that warp vortex and suck all of them in, right? Maybe even leave one juicy, tempting planet for the Tyranid Hive Fleet to gravitate towards. And then once they're there, just suck them up with a series of detonated warp vortexes. Basically just, again, self-destructing ships that just have a skeleton crew, fly into the Hive Fleet, go critical, and then vanish into the warp.
With virus bombs. This catastrophic level of civilian deaths and his lies to the Ultramarines would enrage them and other Imperial forces. Worse would be to come though when Cripman would order the single largest self-inflicted atrocity in Imperial history, when he would order a system-wide scorched earth tactic by using exterminatus on every planet within the reach of Hive Fleet Leviathan, so as to effectively starve them of biomatter. He would later, due to these actions, be denounced as a traitor to the Imperium and carta externis by his fellow Inquisitors. But Cripman still held loyal allies within the Astartes Death Watch, and the final fate of Hive Fleet Leviathan was far from over. The Tyranids and their ongoing tyrannic wars would change the Imperium forever, but there are many who believe that their invasions of the galaxy have only just begun. Further examination of Imperial records after the Tyrannic Wars had begun revealed disturbing facts. Facts that suggest the Tyranids had been around for a much longer period of time, and that predatory creatures like the Katashan Devil and Fenrisian Kraken are actually ancient descendants of Tyranid Hive fleets, perhaps long since abandoned or forgotten by the Hive. Records of the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition have suggested Tyranid contact as far back as Millennium 35. Bioships of Tyranid configuration were also discovered on an ice planet after Imperial Guard was sent to deal with an Orc threat there. Tyranids would burst out attacking the guardsmen sent, but they could not understand how this was possible, as no Tyranid ships were in orbit of the planet. Eventually they realised that as long ago as 7,000 years, a full Tyranid Hive ship had crashed into the planet and remained dormant ever since. The prospect of it reanimating and sending out psychic distress calls is something that they could not allow to happen. Eventually the Imperial forces are able to destroy the Hive ship by enabling massive volcanic eruptions which consume and destroy the trapped ship and all its horrific inhabitants. But these events suggested that the Tyranids had been present even earlier than Millennium 45, perhaps anything longer than even 1,000 years prior, and it also penetrated further in.
So that would probably explain why the Tyranids are so capable of destroying humans and humanity's forces, is probably because they have a fair amount of homework done, right? They probably have a sense of the human psyche and human battle tactics and that sort of thing, and that would explain why they have such well-tailored forces to fight them. Though again, you ask my opinion, they should have just done it with a disease, right? Listen, killing human beings is like the least efficient way possible. If you want to kill human beings, you have to use a huge weapon, i.e. like a nuclear weapon, or you use a tiny weapon like a biological weapon. Human beings are really good at fighting other human-sized threats.
Into Imperial space.
By human-sized, I mean like as small as like a dog and as big as like a bear, right? Human beings are great at fighting those. Because we're evolved to be hunters. Those are our preferred targets. We're not evolved to be particularly clean or hygienic, and that's why we sort of lose to bacteria. And we're not, of course, evolved to withstand any sort of nuclear radiation or explosion, and that's why we tend to lose to big explosions
than was previously thought. The prospect of other deliberately hidden or preemptively placed hive ships was a greatly concerning realization. But it's also possible that these earlier fleets were defeated and repelled by another race like the Eldar. The Tyranids are one of the most severe threats to not just the Imperium, but the entire galaxy, and even though they have wrought terrible destruction through the first fleets that have appeared, a much worse possibility exists, that so far the Tyranid Hive fleets are just initial tendrils. They are really scouting parties of a much larger and exponentially more dangerous main fleet, as yet unseen, still travelling through the void toward the Milky Way galaxy.
So, we've discussed this in other videos. Here, I think this is just his cinematic outro. Oh, here we go. Yeah. This is just a cinematic outro. My theory with the Tyranids remains that they are probably, my headcanon or pet theory is that the Tyranids are actually a series of species engaging in what's called convergent evolution. And that is subject to the same evolutionary pressures that the same traits will evolve across multiple species. And the Tyranids, I think, are every galaxy, right? Something becomes the dominant species in that galaxy. And that is one that's capable of evolving rapidly in response to threats, countering the psychic powers within that galaxy, right, or of the Imperium, and consuming very efficiently other natural resources that allow them to do so. And all of those things make you Tyranid-like, right? For example, something like the Borg in Star Trek, their final form may look like a Tyranid, right? Less even where that biology and technology over 10,000 years evolve into a single like highly evolved biotech form with a single consciousness, and the rest with like low levels of intelligence. And so maybe that's the most effective killing machine in 40k, in the 40k, literally in the universe. And so what shows up and are classed as Tyranids, all the same, are in fact just rapid evolutionary species from different galaxies that just sort of show up, right? They meet human beings in a couple of engagements, and they evolve into their optimal human killing configuration, which is, of course, a Tyranid. Anyway, guys, that's sort of my pet theory on 40k, right? It's going to remain true in my heart, even if it's not true to Games Workshop. But Games Workshop doesn't control me. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out the merch store, and I will see you guys next time.